Hey everyone, it's Mr. Lutz. So as you can already tell, I'm not in school on Wednesday. So I'm going to continue going on with what we had already been planning on doing, which was talking about this guy that you can see here with the hair. I know it's King Louis XIV, who's the King of France and a region called Navarre. More importantly, the King of France, who rules for a really long time from 1638 to 1715. Those are not just the years that he lived; those are the entire years that he ruled the country. So if we go back to Monday's class, you guys will remember we just talked about like those four different rulers, kind of figured out what are some characteristics that they have. Then yesterday's class with me being out, you figured out what were some similarities they have, some differences they have. You got the definition of what an absolutist is, which we'll review when I get back, of course. And you went over some examples and kind of asked yourself, do these people meet the characteristics of an absolutist or not, and why or why not? And we'll review that too. And I'll be back to school on Thursday. But I wanted to give you this presentation, which you'll fill out that graphic organizer that you got from the substitute, as a way to kind of just highlight one absolutist. Because if you remember on Friday's class, I'll be assigning you a ruler and you'll be doing a project where you'll start researching someone ruling from this time period, figuring out the same types of characteristics that you're going to see presented in this. So I want you to be familiar with King Louis XIV, and I want you to be familiar with the characteristics that I'm asking you for, because you're going to need to research those same exact type of components for your own person starting on Friday. So what we'll do first is we'll get into the historical context. That is kind of the larger environment in which King Louis XIV is living and is ruling. And as I'm going through this presentation, what you should be doing is kind of just pausing things, jotting down some notes that you see on the presentation in front of you, and I'll kind of just explain some stuff to you as we go along here, okay? So starting with the political context here, the first thing that you see on the left-hand side there, it says that Louis's father, who was creatively named King Louis XIII, and his advisor, Cardinal Richelieu, worked to increase the power of the monarchy by weakening the Protestants, and they even did things like forbidding Protestant towns to have walls. If you remember, the last ruler that we talked about in France was King Henry IV during the Protestant Reformation. He was the one who started Protestant, became king. A lot of Catholics were angered by having a Protestant king, so he converted to Catholicism and then created the Edict of Nantes, which said that French Protestants called Huguenots would be able to practice Protestantism in France. So Louis XIII and his advisor are starting to chip away at the rights and the privileges that Protestants enjoy in society. And again, this is before Louis XIV is even king. Apart from that, Louis XIII and Richelieu are working to weaken the nobles, doing things like ordering castles to be taken down. Instead of giving government positions to members of the nobility, they're giving them to members of the middle class. So France, if you guys recall, a long time ago, we had talked about feudalism. And France is feudal at this time, but that's starting to change. As you see here, the powers of the nobility are weakening, and the king doesn't really need to rely on them for their services as much as earlier kings would have. So to Louis XIV, he's going to be educated by his mother and another cardinal, and this cardinal is called Cardinal Mazarin, who rule on his behalf during his youth. I believe Louis becomes king at like 4 years old, which if I were to go back, you see 1638 to 1715. That explains why he ruled for so long, because he started out so young. Mazarin's going to do some things just to simplify. That's going to earn him the hatred of the nobility. He's going to continue to chip away at their power, and Louis remembers that harsh relationship that's being shared between the crown and the nobility. So that's some of the larger political environment that's going on in France during the time in and around Louis XIV's rule. So socially speaking, you'll see some things are going to overlap here with the politics. If we're talking about the political authority of the nobility declining, well, then that means socially the nobility is weakening as well. They're not involved in government as they once were. Tax rates are starting to go up. The central government is being made stronger. And again, this is chipping away at the expense, at the power, I should say, of the nobility. and nobles begin to riot against Cardinal Mazarin, who, like I said, ruled in Louis XIV's place prior to Louis being old enough to rule. And you see that picture down below. There were even skirmishes and fights and battles between supporters of the nobles and supporters of the crown. So socially, the nobles are really seeing the writing on the wall that their power is potentially really under threat here. Economically speaking, obviously, if this is the time period 1450 to 1750, this is going to be overlapping with things that we've already discussed in class. The French are making their way over to America in the 16th century, even in the late 15th century as well. And they're starting to try to find a Northwest Passage. In other words, a way to sail through the Americas by the Atlantic, sailing all the way across the continent and going out to the Pacific. And you can kind of see the red line kind of explores where the French tried to get through in order to find this access point out into the Pacific, which they never do. But they're still attracted to North America because of the profit that they can earn from the fur trade there. They're going to establish pretty good relations with the Native Americans who can trap the furs for them, and then the French can kind of trade for them and then go back and sell those in Europe as luxury goods. So what this means for the French economy is that they're going to be making more money. They're going to have increased revenue. And that problem of unequal taxation, the lower classes getting slammed with the taxes, while the church pays none, the nobility pays none, that issue becomes relatively ignored because the economy is doing well. Some of the major developments then, to kind of sum it up really quickly, prior to Louis's reign, we've seen then Protestant versus Catholic tensions have kind of been going on for a while. Think back to the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the Edict of Nantes being signed, tensions existing between the Catholics and the Protestants. That has continued on as Louis XIII started to chip away at Protestant rights and privileges. Probably the biggest thing you've seen here is the weakening position of the nobility in society. Don't really need to rehash much there. There's a growing intellectual movement known as skepticism, which if you've ever heard someone say that they're skeptical about something, it kind of means they have their doubts about commonly held truths or beliefs. And that's starting to emerge at this time. So people had been told for such a long time that the church tells you what to believe, your rulers tell you what to believe, and you accept it. And people are starting to, I really want to emphasize that, starting to question those supposedly commonly held truths that have existed. The 30 Years' War had been going on, which was basically a conflict between the Catholics and Protestants throughout Northern Europe, costs lots of loss of life that hadn't been seen since the bubonic plague had kind of hit Europe in the 14th century. And you're starting to see with Louis XIII slightly increasing powers of the monarch, meaning the king is starting to get stronger in terms of authority. So this whole year test thing, we're going to skip that. If I was here in class, you guys would jump to this, but instead I'm just going to go through Louis's influence in these different realms. So we'll start with his political influence. Now, an absolutist, politically speaking, right under where it says political influence, it says that the ruler holds unlimited power with no checks on power by law or government bodies, meaning there are no checks and balances. The individuals are subjects owing loyalty and obedience to that monarch. So when Louis XIV takes charge, when he really reaches the heights of power and takes the charge from Mazarin, he makes the decision, if you remember, he had some hostility against the nobles, he makes the decision to exclude the nobility from his councils. They will be left out of very important decision-making processes. And what he's going to do then at their expense is he increases the power of a group of people known as the intendants, or the intendants. They'll be the tax collectors, they're the local administrators, and they report to him regularly. So he is in direct control of the people who are governing on the local level. Okay. So socially, if Louis XIV is this model absolutist, like I'm telling you that he is, that means then socially, the ruler has to dominate the upper classes, which in turn dominate the lower classes. And ceremonies are going to symbolize the ruler's power. And there's no other place in the world really at this time. Maybe a few. You'll see when you start to do some research, but there are a few on the level of Louis XIV's court that he holds at his palace that's called Versailles. And we'll talk about that shortly here. So the nobility is forced to move to apartments just outside of Louis's palace at Versailles. So meaning then they're forced to move away from the land they control. They're forced to move away from the power base that they've held for such a long time. And they do such stupid things when they're at Versailles. They, like it says there, they're going to attend these ridiculous daily rituals. They will be there watching Louis wake up in the morning. They will be there hoping they have the opportunity to help him dress himself. Not making any of this up. They will be there to watch him eat breakfast. They will be there to watch him lay in bed at night and fall asleep. And these are like massively privileged opportunities for the nobles to have. So they're like competing for these chances. Like this is what their life's become. And so what you see there then is the social life revolves around the king. It does not revolve around the nobility. And so you see the king just start to assume this total control over society. And in this picture, you see the French nobility just lining up, hoping to gain an audience with Louis. So economically, if he's going to be the absolutist, as I say that he is, that means he's going to encourage industry and trade to strengthen the economy. Now, his economic advisor is a guy named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He's going to make France self-sufficient by increasing manufacturing. He is a mercantilist. It's a term we learned about back when we studied the Age of Exploration, meaning he wants France to hold on to as much money as it possibly can. So how do you do that? You manufacture expensive goods and you export them throughout the world while you import, you bring in cheap raw materials. And that chart on your left-hand side should kind of give you a rundown of how that works there. In order to prevent a lot of foreign trade goods coming in for the French people to buy, remember they want to keep that low, he's going to place a high tariff or a tax on those goods to protect French industry. He's going to encourage French expansion into their colonial settlements because that means then more raw materials can come back to France. The fur trade is going to help. But the stupid decision that Louis is going to make, and we'll get to this in a second as well in a little bit more detail, Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes, which if you remember, that was the edict made by King Henry IV that said, we're a Catholic country, but Protestants can practice Protestantism legally, no problem. Louis took that away and said, we are only Catholic, end of discussion. So what that meant is a lot of the French Protestants, the Huguenots, fled, and so France lost a lot of its skilled workers. So culturally speaking, as we say here, the ruler is going to dominate cultural life either as a patron of the arts, one who pays for arts to be done in his name, or by censoring the arts and making sure nothing is produced that would hurt his ever so delicate feelings. So he takes the Edict of Nantes away, Protestantism illegal in France again. His palace of Versailles, which you guys can see, this is kind of this picture looking at kind of the back step. Oh, there's my dog Nessie. He says hello. This is kind of looking out the back step of Versailles, and everything that you guys can see in that image, every single tree in that picture is property of the king's palace grounds at Versailles. This is how huge it is, and everything is expertly manicured like you can see here. So there's so many people that are going to be employed at Versailles just to keep it looking as beautiful as it possibly can. Otherwise, ballet, opera becomes really popular thanks to him. He's going to be one who funds those types of things. The ceilings at Versailles, they'll have artwork all over them. There will be art everywhere at Versailles, and all of that is going to elevate his power. So he's all for it. He's going to be throwing the cash at that type of stuff if it promotes his brand, his name, his power, his authority. So to kind of sum up, just some major developments of Louis XIV's France at this time. Militarily, France gains territory. Louis fights a lot of wars at this time. He primarily gains territory at the expense of the Netherlands, which was a Protestant country at this time. A lot of European countries start to get pretty freaked out by growing French power. So Spain, Sweden, Habsburg Empire, which is kind of like modern day Austria and some parts of like Eastern and farther south, Southern Europe, they're going to unify to check the power of France. There will be some years where the crop growth isn't really good. Harvests are going to be pretty bad. And high taxes are going to start to get raised because of all these wars being fought. And this is going to make life harder on France's poorest citizens It's a little bit of foreshadowing to the French Revolution where we'll really see this whole thing blow up. They're going to fight a war for the Spanish succession, where technically Louis was to inherit the throne in Spain, or at least his nephew, I believe was. I can't recall exactly who it was. But war was fought to ensure that, okay, Louis, the French could technically put someone from their family on the throne in Spain, but it would not be unified with France. And the Palace of Versailles, sure, it would be known all around the world as this beautiful palace, and all these leaders are going to model their palaces after Versailles. And you'll probably see one of your rulers very well may be one who does that, but it's really costly. And it has a really, at times, negative reputation among the people in France because it was built with their money, and they don't get to enjoy it. So finally, last thing, if this isn't obvious to you, let me make it obvious to you. Of course, Louis has no checks and balances. When he's young, he has Cardinal Mazarin, who's kind of governing in his place. But as he gets older, his power is unlimited. Now, Louis does have councils that he consults with. He has the intendants that govern on a local level. He has ministers that help out as well. But Louis makes all the key decisions. They ultimately report to him. They do not decide things independent of Louis. So that's really it, okay? So as we sum up here, you guys should probably pause this several times throughout or go back, rewind, fill things out on that graphic organizer, complete that. You need that done for Friday. You're going to be able to use this sheet in coordination with your notes on the England reading that you guys have looked at for maybe the last day or so. If you haven't, you'll look at it as soon as you're done this. And you'll kind of see, whereas France's monarch's power is pretty unlimited, in England, it might start out that way at times, but Parliament is going to give the king a really hard time, and they're really going to work to limit the authority of the monarch in England. So a little bit of a comparison between France and England. Absolute monarchs in France, unchecked power, limited monarchs or constitutional monarchs in England who don't have that absolute authority. So that's what we'll talk about probably on Thursday for a little bit, and we'll also preview your project on Friday, and you guys will take that quiz. You'll be all set to go. All right. So thanks. Hope your Wednesday goes well, and I will see you guys hopefully on Thursday. See ya.